welcome all of you to the Thomas Scholl lecture by visiting entrepreneurs. Mr. Scholl himself has taken a trip from Washington, D.C. to be present in the lecture series that he has so generously sponsored at Stevens Institute of Technology. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank Tom Scholl. Many of you know that I have known Tom for a long time now. It's certainly more than 2 decades. We have been very close friends, and we have worked together in a number of different capacities over the course of the past 20-some years. Soon after I joined Stevens Institute of Technology, Tom also joined the Board of Trustees of the university, and he's playing a very active role in promoting a culture of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial thinking at the university. As a major step toward his efforts, he's also putting his money where his mouth is, sponsoring this lecture series so generously. And I just wanted to extend to you my personal gratitude, and of course on behalf of the entire institution, for this level of unparalleled dedication. This lecture series, of course, is intended to invite experienced, seasoned entrepreneurs to come to Stevens to share their experiences with members of our community, so that new generations of entrepreneurs who come out of our laboratories and classrooms can benefit from these experiences and become more successful in their own endeavors. I am immensely honored to introduce the speaker today. Before I mention his name, I thought I would say a word about the title of his talk. I'm sure you've all seen that. The talk is entitled Lowering Cost of Failure to Unleash Innovation. In my opinion, this is a very important topic, and I am as anxious to hear what our speaker has to say about this as you are. As you probably know, significant resources for doing new things, for developing innovative solutions, exist in larger corporations. Unfortunately, larger corporations tend to be more conservative and less of a risk taker. On the other hand, smaller organizations, startup organizations, are much more willing to take risk, but they don't have resources, and therefore failure could be very costly for them. So understanding what one could do in order to lower the cost of failure so that more of those organizations who don't have extensive resources can contribute to innovation is a very interesting topic. The speaker is Mr. Lew Steinberg. And by way of background, I should say that he has an illustrious record of accomplishments. I have a lengthy description of his accomplishments, which I'm not going to cover in its entirety, but I will highlight some aspects of it. I would start by probably the most important aspect that took place a few decades ago, and that was receiving a bachelor's and a master's degree from Stevens Institute of Technology. He graduated from this university with 2 degrees in computer science. Lew currently is the Chief Technology Officer at TD Ameritrade, where he's been since July of 2011. In that capacity, he is responsible for technology platform architecture, for engineering, operations, security, advanced technology, and enterprise testing, in addition to evolving the current operating models. He's also responsible for technology and operational risk, and for fostering a culture of innovation within that gigantic organization. Prior to joining TD Ameritrade, he had a sequence of entrepreneurial ventures. These include Rev2, Cranit Systems, and NetOps. In addition to his startup experiences, Lew has held senior positions at several major sort of household corporations. He was CTO of Symbol Technologies, which is now Motorola. He was Senior Vice President of Marketing and Market Development at Micromuse, which is now IBM. And he had more than a decade of experience at IBM itself in various technical and management positions. Lou does a lot of other things outside the very successful career that he has had. That includes being entrepreneur in residence at the private equity firm Warburg Pincus, and a strategy advisor to senior management at major corporations such as Comcast, Citigroup, and NCR. He serves on a number of other advisory boards, and he advises smaller startup companies. I'm also happy to tell you that Lou is a member of the Board of Visitors of the School of Systems and Enterprises at Stevens Institute of Technology. And perhaps most importantly, he's the father of a student at Stevens who might be actually in the audience. Is Tim in the audience? Yes, indeed. He's sitting right there. And as a result, Lou and his wife, May, are members of the Parents Council at Stevens Institute of Technology. So without further ado, I'm going to give the stage to Mr. Lou Steinberg, who is in hiding, but I'm asking him to come out, please. Lou? Yes. Thank you very much.
This is all news.
Perfect. Thank you. I should just open with, I heard President Farvardin say that Tim is in the audience. Tim, I'm sure you get credit for missing a class because you're here with the president of the university, so you're safe this once. Thanks for coming. Lowering the cost of failure to unleash innovation. You know, we tend to think of failure as something we have to avoid. And in this talk, I'm actually going to take the other side. And I'm going to look at how the perceived cost of failure, call it fear, drives a culture of risk avoidance. And when you avoid risk, you lower an organization's ability to innovate. So if Stevens is, as I believe, the innovation university, we're going to have to embrace failure and teach how to lower its cost, even encourage it. That said, failure has to be managed so that innovations produced are usable. And in fact, when I say innovation, I'm intentionally not saying invention. Both are important, and this talk could have easily have been about either. But I'm an engineer more than a scientist, and invention's about the creation of something new. Innovation is about applying inventions, new or old, in new ways. So I won't ramble on about my bio. You heard a lot. Basically, it means I can't hold a job since I've done so many different things. But what I will say is that a number of my successes to date have been because of my failures. I'll give you the end at the beginning. That way anybody who doesn't want to stay can write this down and take off. There are 4 big ideas we're going to explore. They're in 4 roughly aligned topics. The topics are why the speed of innovation matters, how a fear of failure inhibits taking risk, 2 challenges you have to avoid when you do take risk, and then how do you actually put this into practice? What do you do with this? Good? Am I in the right lecture hall? Good. All right, so first I want to explore why innovation matters and why the speed of innovation actually matters more. The key point we're going to discuss are that companies are failing and being replaced at a rate we've never seen before. A big driver of this is consumer demand, directly or indirectly, and the pressure to meet this demand is accelerating. So let's start with the failure rate of large entrenched companies. President Navard said that we see large companies fearful of taking risk, and that's absolutely right. But that doesn't mean they're not failing. In fact, 5 years ago, the Babson-Olin School of Business said 40% of the Fortune 500 companies would fail by 2021. And that's because the average lifespan of an S&P listed company used to be over 60 years. Now it's 15. On average, a company is being replaced in the S&P every 2 weeks. Take a look at the trend in the graph up here. It shows that the average age of a Standard & Poor's listed company, it's not only declined, it's continuing to decline. Now, in the old model, small companies were risky and big companies were stable, and that was easy. Now, big companies fold, and small companies innovate to get big. A couple examples. Uber is the world's largest transportation company with $1.5 billion in revenue. It's 7 years old. Airbnb is the largest lodging company in the world. It's 8 years old. This rate of failure isn't limited to the largest companies in the S&P. In fact, John Chambers, the outgoing CEO of Cisco, just last year said that 1 in 3 existing companies won't survive 10 years. 1 in 3 won't survive a decade. Great case study for this is Kodak. Kodak was founded in the late 1800s, and by 1996, they were at the pinnacle of anything to do with pictures. They had 140,000 employees, a market cap of $28 billion. 6 years later, they'd shed 88% of their workforce as they filed for bankruptcy. That same year, in fact, I think that same month, Instagram was bought by Facebook with just 13 employees and a value of $1 billion. What happened? Well, Kodak viewed themselves as in the print photography business, and they ignored disruptive innovation in the form of digital photography. Apple's innovation was to bundle the camera with the first iPhone in 2007. And in 2010, Instagram innovated and enabled instant sharing of pictures from your mobile device. By 2012, the concept of taking your film to the drugstore to make prints and mailing them to your friends and family was arcane. It was the end of Kodak. Now, it's worth remembering that Instagram didn't invent digital photography. Kodak did. But that was an invention they didn't bring to market as an innovation, and it cost them everything. So big companies that don't innovate become obsolete. And it gets worse as the demand for faster innovation grows. The innovation cycle times have never been shorter, and they're actually now coming from consumer expectations of technology. So let me explain that. Technology innovation used to be led by business, and the cycle time was low. Like, how often did we invent a new mainframe? Somewhere in early 2000, consumers started bringing in tech on their own. They didn't adopt hand-me-down technology, they purchased something new. Now, consumers are the driving force behind technology purchases, and both directly and indirectly drive a massive spend on computers and data centers and software. And what's interesting is that while companies cut cost in their innovation, consumers didn't want a race to the bottom with competition on price. They wanted a race to new features, a race to innovation. Give me new capabilities. And companies are now competing on the speed at which they can bring out those new capabilities. One example, the Apple App Store adds 60,000 new releases per month. That's more than one a minute. And that rate is accelerating. And we've seen the same acceleration play out in traditionally low-tech sectors, too. Picture on the top left is something I took while on a family vacation in Rome. The Colosseum took, by most estimates, about 7 years to build. The house on the right is a bit more modest, but it was 3D printed in one day. And in fact, 9 others were 3D printed that exact same day. So somebody built 10 houses back to back with a printer. The phone on the bottom left is actually the phone that hung on the wall in my parents' home when I was a kid. The little box on the right is a PBX, a phone switch, that now runs in my home and serves all the phones in my house, provides voicemail and call forwarding and all kinds of features. That used to take a floor of a building at AT&T. In my lifetime, we went from a big phone to a little switch. The point is, there's an insatiable demand for innovation, and competition to satisfy it is resulting in new products and technologies, and companies who don't keep up don't get to exist. So the need to innovate is existential, and the demand is accelerating, and success is no longer assured by strength and size. It's by speed and agility. What holds us back? It's the perceived cost of failing. It keeps us from taking risks on new innovations. So like the gentleman on this ATV, the impact just looks too painful. Reducing the cost is the key to unleashing innovation, and that's what we're going to explore next. So I first started thinking about the relationship between the cost of failure and innovation back in the 1990s. I was working as an engineer at IBM, who was a leader at invention. And the products that we released at IBM to the market seemed to be losing their innovative edge. They were the result of safe, incremental roadmaps. Why? Well, product managers were being measured on the commercial success or failure of their product. And a failure could end your career. So no one was going to take a gamble on something new and innovative and scary. The safe thing to do was take small risks that had a high probability of succeeding. Innovation was being held back by what the product team saw as a high personal cost of failure. They wouldn't take the risk. At the same time, Silicon Valley was emerging as a center of innovation. It was fueled by entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. And critically, we were starting to see serial entrepreneurs. These are people who had done more than one company, who'd been funded more than once. What struck me was that many of the founders had failed with a prior company and were getting funded to try again. The reputational and career cost of failure was low. There was no penalty for having failed. They'll fund you, which means that entrepreneurs were going to keep trying new innovative things until one of them hit. In the chart above, you see that 65% of venture investments over a 9-year period return equal to or less than the money that was put in. These are failures, 65%. But Jeff Bezos over at Amazon said it brilliantly in his annual letter to investors. He said, failure and invention are inseparable twins. To invent, you have to experiment, and if you know in advance it's not going to work, then it's not an experiment. This is one of those places where I think you can substitute the word innovation for invention. So it wasn't just Silicon Valley. I saw the same thing happening in open source. Now, I'm over 40, so when I think of open source, I think of a public repository called SourceForge. It's the grandfather of where these projects were formed. And if you look at the top 20 projects today in SourceForge and count the number of times each one was downloaded, you can see there are a handful of very successful ones. But it quickly falls off. By the time you get to number 20, you've dropped to 1/10,000th the download rate of number 1. And it's in the top 20. If that level of activity isn't a failure, what happens when you get to project 500 or 5,000 or 50,000? There are 500,000 projects on SourceForge. Almost all of them failed. Now, for the students in the crowd who never heard of SourceForge, it's kind of like a black and white television. And for the freshmen in the crowd, a television is what we used to watch when we didn't have videos on mobile phones. Regardless, the modern version of SourceForge is called GitHub, and instead of downloads, you can think of forks as a measure of success. It doesn't matter. It's the exact same pattern. It repeats again. It tails off. Most things fail. But the interesting thing is that when someone in the open source community works on a project that fails, that goes nowhere, the cost of failure is low. They don't get shunned by the community. They pick another project, they try again, and they keep trying until it works. People are willing to take risks that sometimes pay off because the downside of failure is, in fact, low. As I said, I started this thinking at IBM, and one of my best failures came as part of a small team there in the late 80s that was awarded a contract to upgrade a network that was called DARPANET to something called NSFNet. Anyone ever hear of NSFNet? Okay, back in the late 80s, it was the backbone of a thing we were building called the Internet. Maybe you've heard of it? Good. Actually, back in 1987, everybody on the Internet was on a first-name basis when we were building this. It was that small. But the tech that we built to create an upgraded backbone drove circuits 30 times faster than DARPANET, the fastest we'd ever gone on a network. And IBM delivered that. Then my boss, a guy named Paul Bosco, had a special request. He told me he needed a new interface capable of running a full T3 backbone circuit. There was another group in IBM that was trying to build it. He wanted to commit that we would have it in 9 to 12 months. Could I lead a team to deliver this for him? Sure. Why not? I said. He's my boss. He needs it. After he left the room, I turned to the engineer next to me and asked, "What's a T3?" It turned out to be 30 times faster than the hardware we just deployed, which was 30 times faster than the backbone that we were replacing. The picture that you see here is, in fact, one of the first full-speed T3 cards that ran on the Internet backbone. I'll talk more about my failure with that in a minute. But the key here is what Paul had done, was he let us commit to things we had no idea how to deliver, and then go innovate solutions. And there was always a risk it would be late or not work, but he shielded us from the cost of that failure. And without that approach, this second-generation Internet backbone would not have emerged the way it did. So this all makes sense. Why would companies create a high cost of failure? I actually think there are three main things that drive it and which prevent companies from innovating, but that often leads to the very failures that they feared. The first one is fear of disrupting an existing successful business. They simply don't accept the possibility of their success being challenged. The inertia that big companies have as a result of this is what gives startups that edge. In my experience, it happens most often with businesses generating substantial revenue, certainly over 100 million a year, often over $1 billion. And we talked about Kodak as an example, so I'm not going to pick on them again. Let's talk about Microsoft. They were so keen to protect their Windows franchise that they were late to mobile and late to tablets. They delayed introducing a full-featured version of Office for the Mac, and they still won't port their email server to Linux. And as a result, they've let competitors come into all three of those spaces. The second fear shows up when a company knows they're on the wrong path, but they're trapped and they don't know how to say it. Maybe they committed to their board or to Wall Street, and so they have to push ahead. And Valeant, a drug company, is a great example of this. Their stock did really well as they acquired companies with other drugs and then raised the prices. Made a lot of money. But people became outraged that they couldn't afford medicine. Congress called hearings. 3 federal investigations kicked off into their accounting and pricing practices. The stock lost 90% of the value, and the CEO resigned for health reasons. And I have to wonder if he can afford his own medicines now. The last fear happens when a company dogmatically sticks to their plan, even in the face of new information. So startups are as guilty of this one as anyone because they believe too much in their original idea. Most successful startups don't end up doing what they thought they were going to do when they began. You ever hear of YouTube? Did you know it started as a dating site with video? Ever hear of Groupon? Did you know it started as an activist organizing site? These were not the original plans, but they were successful because they pivoted. Blockbuster, on the other hand. How many of you go into Blockbuster on a regular basis? Right. Blockbuster stuck to their business of in-store video rentals even when Netflix showed a competing model of convenience by delivering DVDs through the mail. Streaming came later, right? It was just a convenience play. Blockbuster said, no, we want to keep the traffic into our stores. We can sell them popcorn. They're not selling them popcorn. They're not selling them anything now. Another great example is BlackBerry. RIM invented the smartphone, but insisted on owning the apps, not owning an app store. And as a result, BlackBerry is now a fraction of its former self, and Apple and Google, with their app stores, have taken off. So sticking to the plan is the third reason why companies fail. If you can get past those fears by creating an environment where the cost of failure is low, you can encourage people to take risk that leads to innovation. But there are two things you have to manage when you do this, because you're going to unleash risk-taking. The first thing to remember is that risk is cumulative. It adds up. Remember my story about the T3 card at IBM? I missed my delivery date. The competing team took a lot of risk. They took design and test shortcuts to hit their schedule. They used new, untested technologies. They pushed the limit of the specs of the hardware that they bought. And if each one of these had its own probability of failure, the probability of failure of their card was the sum of all of those probabilities. Their early prototypes didn't fit into the computer they had to run it. And they ran so hot that it required buckets of ice to cool it. Now, I don't know about you, but my home networking device doesn't need periodic ice refresh. Once they actually deployed their card, it began to crash daily. So my card was 4 months late to the party, but we had experienced so much pain by then that the decision was made to rip out the winner and replace it with successive generations of the card I designed. I'd only taken risk in one dimension, schedule, and as a result could deliver something solid. Risk is cumulative. Pick one area, not all. The second challenge is unaligned results. You can take risk and invent something new, but if the outcome doesn't match a need, those results are meaningless. So this typically happens in corporate R&D ivory tower functions that are disconnected from the underlying business. When I joined a company called Symbol Technologies as CTO, we had a research team that was experimenting with amazing stuff. They could point an audio stream at an individual person. Only you would hear what I'm saying, not the people next to you. That's really cool, directed beams of audio. The issue is we made mobile computers and scanners, not audio beaming equipment. So the group had a low cost of failure, and they were inventing and innovating as they went, but there was no application for those innovations. All right, so we know that we have to innovate to succeed. We can lower the cost of failure to enable risk-taking, and we have to manage the risk so that it stays aligned and doesn't accumulate and get too big. Conceptually makes sense. How do you put it into practice? Well, it turns out there's a model for investing in innovation which removes the cost of failure and manages the risk. Interested? Good. This is based on my experience in venture capital, and it actually encourages investment in a portfolio of risky innovations. Why? Remember the problem I saw at IBM where the product teams wouldn't take risk because they couldn't let their product fail? The question I asked when I first put this into practice was, what if we let the product teams outsource risk? What if they could be capitalists to the upside and socialists to the downside? What if an advanced technology group was formed that was funded to create a portfolio of innovations? And their measure of success was based on what the product teams picked up from them and actually implemented. The product teams would only take successes, so zero cost of failure. The advanced tech team would be measured on a portfolio, so you can have failures and move on to try again, like we saw with open source and venture capital and the entire Silicon Valley ecosystem. So this system would self-regulate accumulated risk and business alignment in order to hit the performance targets of the portfolio. Here's how it works. I've done this twice, by the way. We start with ideas and they move through a pipeline of stages. But for business-aligned ideas, we always start with a venture capital style exit to a product team in mind. The ideas come in from anywhere. Anybody who can start a sentence with the words, "what if we could," qualifies for a concept. But we're going to ask a couple of key questions of these concepts. Number one, can it fail? If it can't fail, you're not taking risk, you're not innovating, that's product development, that's not what this team does. Who would we exit to? We want the name of a product owner that needs this innovation. And then we go validate with them that this thing is actually valuable. If we can't identify someone to hand it off to, we typically don't start. The third question is, who do we need help from to optimize for the transition? We might ask a business or development team to participate, in part so that we stay aligned with their real needs. It also facilitates the transfer at the end of our proof of concept, if it's successful. So, since I mentioned a proof of concept, let me be clear. This team takes and absorbs the risk of something that might fail. They aren't a product team, and they're not allowed to own products. Their goal is to innovate, demonstrate the art of the possible, and then transition the technology and that knowledge to a team that owns product and needs a solution in the marketplace. Now, there is a second kind of investment, one which has the potential to be disruptive to our company or our industry, and it follows a very similar process, only those can happen without the clarity of who are we going to exit to. These are like CEO sponsored, and when they do get realized, it's because you need them and you're glad you have them. 90% of the time, what we're doing is aligned investment, and this model works. The governance for it looks very much like a venture capital model. We have an investment thesis in a number of sectors that we strategically believe innovations are needed. And the sectors are reviewed quarterly by senior leaders. Any new concept gets mapped against them to make sure that we are strategically aligned with the direction of the business. The projects get approved and funded by the advanced tech leadership, and that function has a budget, which means they have a limited capacity, and that incents them to pick things that have a good risk-return ratio. Once we approve something, every project gets tracked through its life cycle, and the intent here is to kill it quickly if it looks like it's not going to work. Now, we don't celebrate killing projects like Google's X division. We're just trying to free up capacity so we can try something new if this isn't going to work. But the real magic of the venture portfolio model is in setting and measuring targets for exits. To do this, we have to set a value of an exit. When something works and gets adopted by the business, we have something we call proposed value that works very much like this. We go to the business owner and say, "Glad you're taking it, it's free. Tell me something. If you were going to pay somebody for what we just delivered, a third party, a consultancy out in the marketplace, what would you be willing to pay them for this?" Now, you get it for free, and we're not going to challenge the number you give us, but it gives us a roughly right value to the business. When you measure your exit value across the portfolio and over time, you get to have some failures in the portfolio, but you make up for that with your successes. The key is all around the mix. We have a mix of projects in the portfolio aligned with sectors, and a mix of investments in each sector, and a mix of things with potentially large and small exits. And the large-small thing is important because the little risks that we take tend to be more likely but low value. And it's really, really hard to hit the return on investment target for your portfolio if you're just taking lots of little risks. On the other side, if you swing for the fences every time, most of the time you're going to strike out, and it's really, really hard to hit the exit value of your portfolio if you're just taking ginormous risks because you're probably going to fail. What this does is it requires you to have a balance between some singles and doubles and some home runs. By picking the correct rate of return for the full portfolio over time, this system regulates itself. The model works, but only because we expect some things are going to fail. Without failure, there isn't risk. Without risk, there isn't innovation. In the example chart above, over about 4 quarters, almost half of the projects we selected failed. They weren't transitioned to our business. A quarter of them were. Those are successful. And the rest are in various states of consideration. But you have to be willing to fail a lot. If people were concerned about working on a failed initiative, they would only do safe things, and we wouldn't have the successes to offset the failures. What we did was we lowered the cost of failure to the product teams. They only take success. And we lowered the cost of failure to the advanced tech team. They get measured on a portfolio, not a project. And the entire system works. Now, like any new venture fund, when you begin, there's an investment phase where you're actually spending more money on the people and the projects than you're getting back. So the ROI starts out negative. But when you manage it right, it flips to a positive in about 18 months. So there were 4 big ideas here. They're worth repeating. And fortunately, people a lot smarter than me and more eloquent than me said them first. So all I did was package them and reduce it to practice. The first big idea is that you have to innovate to survive. And the speed of that innovation is accelerating. And Jack Welch said that best. The second is we have to take risk to innovate and manage the downside of either too much risk or risk with unaligned value. But you can't avoid risk-taking if you want to innovate and win. Wayne Gretzky, hockey player, said you're going to miss 100% of the shots you don't take. We've talked about how risk-taking is reduced to unhealthy levels when the cost of failure is perceived to be high, when it could economically cost me or impact my career, anything like that. This is at the core of why Silicon Valley and open source work. Reducing the cost of failure permits failure. Permitting failure results in risk-taking. Risk-taking leads to innovation. Elon Musk said, if you're not failing, you're not innovating enough. And then lastly, a well-structured portfolio of managed risk, modeled after venture capital, reduces the cost of failure, all while self-regulating risk tolerance and alignment. You win at innovation through the performance of the portfolio, but you accept that a lot of things won't work. Jeff Bezos at Amazon said, given a 10% chance of a 100-time payout, you should take that bet every time. But you're going to be wrong 9 times out of 10. For better or for worse, that's it. That's the secret. I hope it was helpful. I hope the model's informative. And I hope that you can figure out how to lower the cost of your own failure so you can innovate more. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you. It was very interesting listening to everything. Can you expand a little bit more on the outsourcing model you have with the individual innovators? I mean, I understand the venture capitalist model. I understand the fact that you're reducing risk by diversifying the portfolio of investments. But then what governance structure do you have with these actual individuals? How do you commit or not commit to their ideas? When do you say goodbye? You know, the risk part, which is again touch on what you're saying. Thank you.
In terms of the outsourcing model itself, a lot of the ideas come from the business side. They need something, they want something, but they're not going to take a flyer on it. They don't know if it's going to work. Their participation in this sort of little outsourced venture from their perspective keeps us aligned with their goal. And we're doing that okay right now. I think we could do more of that. But that works. In terms of the valuation at the end, it really is did this have value to you and how much? Because I know how much I spend on the advanced tech team. I have salaries, I have You know, they hire third parties, they buy software and hardware. So we have a cost. The business is now coming back and valuing what we gave them, and that creates the ROI. I get a return versus the investment, and the goal is a nice big positive number.
How scalable is this, both at the low end and at the high end? I'm sure you always think about the high end. But
of course.
How small can you go?
Yeah. So how small can you scale it down? Well, I'm pretty sure you can't scale down to one idea, because that's the exact opposite of building a portfolio. I think it depends on the mix of investments in your portfolio and the likelihood of failure, right? So if you've got that 90% chance of failing that Bezos was talking about, and you only try 2 things, chances are you were too small. You scaled down too far. What that means is you end up having to self-calibrate towards less risky things. But if you do only less risky things, you don't get as much upside. So it's probably a function of industry. It's probably a function of the level of risk-return ratio on the typical project, understanding there's a continuum. But I'll give you a great example, because it's one you and I were just talking about. I'm thinking about starting a security incubator. And I recognized early on that we were going to try a bunch of different ideas in the information security space to solve some real problems. And I could just go off and fund my next startup and build another company to try to solve a problem, but I would have all of my eggs in one basket, that startup. On the other hand, if I incubate 6 or 7 or 8 different ideas at the same time, that puts me in a very different place. Even if 1 or 2 or 3 don't work, that's fine, because the portfolio does. This actually brings up a gap that most startups don't understand that exists between them and the venture capitalists that fund them. As the CEO of a startup that raises venture capital, I only have one company. I have no portfolio of risk. It works or it doesn't, and it's a high-risk venture. My investors typically invest in a lot of companies, right? They don't care if one goes belly up. They're going to push a number of companies to take risky bets in the hope that one of them makes it big. So you actually have, you know, that exact model playing out in venture-funded startups, where you can scale down to one, and now, you know, the company will say failure is not an option, and it's not to them. To their investors, failure is absolutely an option. Happens half the time. So scaling down, I think you have to look at the risk return that you want to get out of the system and the kind of bets you're willing to make. Long answer to a short question, but I hope that helped.
You mentioned earlier that at one point everyone on the internet was on a first-name basis. Mm-hmm. Given your position within your companies, did you have any idea what the internet was going to blossom into and you know, what it's become today?
No, I was clueless. Another great failure of mine. In those days, you got to remember, NSFNet was being used to transfer data between essentially supercomputing centers. The National Science Foundation was funding at different universities, places like Cornell. And you know, this was before the web. And you know, they were mostly doing things like file transfers, stuff like that. And one day, a buddy of mine, John Leddy, came into my office. Now, we're building the backbone. We're building the plumbing of the internet. And John comes into my office and says, you gotta see this. It's a thing called NCSA Mosaic. They call it a web browser. It's really cool. Now, there were no websites, right? So did I have any idea what we were doing? Of course not. I looked at it and went, I don't get it. I said, John, I'm a plumber. I build plumbing. What you put in the pipes, that's your business. That's fundamentally uninteresting to me. So I'm the guy that called the very first web browser fundamentally uninteresting. I would have to say, no, I did not know what we were building at the time.
We're a university. I'm wondering how you could transfer some of your wisdom to the way we do business. What kind of risk-taking do you think would be appropriate for a place like Stevens?
Well, I would, and by the way, I'm not in your business. So for me to lecture you on how your business works seems a little bit bizarre. What I would suggest is the university is doing two different things. We're educating students, and we want to create innovators, and we have to teach risk as a part of that. Risk is good. You have to manage it. You have to build systems that self-calibrate, but risk is good and failure is okay. And if you had seen some of my early organic chemistry exams, you would know that I thought failure was okay. The second thing is, I would say that there's a second mission for the university, which is research. And there are two forms of research going on. There's invention. There's pure scientific discovery, and that's important. And without it, we wouldn't have a bunch of key things that we have today, like transistors. On the other hand, there's the application of that, innovation. And I think as Stevens thinks about where it wants to put its budget, its money, and it thinks about the innovation areas it wants to invest in, it should be thinking about it like a venture capitalist and thinking about a portfolio of things we're going to try, accepting that some will fail, and the faculty and students and grad students who work on them don't get penalized for that, because as soon as you punish someone for failure, they will stop taking the risks you want. So I suspect there's a way to apply it. I'd have to actually look at your system to figure out the detail. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to say thanks again.
So, Lou, what an inspiring talk.
Thanks.
I just want to say this is the reason I feel so good about this lecture series. It's, as you saw for yourself, it's impossible to give a talk like this unless you've been there and done that. You can't make it up. And he's clearly been there and done that. And Lou, thanks for taking the time. We want to give you a plaque to remember this occasion with. And you know, since you came to Stevens, and you know what Stevens is like, we got another little gift for you too, that perhaps you can show the audience what it is.
I know exactly what this is.
This is a 3D bust of Lou. So we can put that on his desk at work.
I've been busted. Thanks again.
Thank you.